So we're really excited to be here and excited to kick off our afternoon with a few personal stories, and then we're going to lead into some workshops. So we wanted to start, though, by telling you a little bit about whether you've heard of HRuprise or not. You definitely will be familiar by the end of the day today. I wanted to tell you a little bit about how it was even created, how we even got started. So our story begins, like probably a lot of yours, when Me Too went viral about a year and a half ago. We, like many of you, were having very similar conversations. I was hearing from a lot of my male friends and family saying, wow, I had no idea this had affected so many women. I had no idea how many women in my life have been affected by harassment, by sexual assault. And yet none of the women in my life were surprised at the sheer volume and magnitude of the issue. And so, like many of you, we started having conversations ourselves. And we were talking within the workplace about it. And it wasn't very long before we started to kind of look inward. And for myself, I looked back at my career, looking at it from a professional context, and I thought, you know, on the whole, I've been pretty fortunate. I certainly have sat across the table in an interview setting or an investigation setting from women, mostly, who had experienced far worse than anything I had. But it wasn't very long, though, before I realized that there was actually a lot more to my story than I even recognized at first.
Hello. It never fails, by the way. We are not going to have an afternoon lull before it gets into my story because we are really exciting. And it never fails, I just want to point out that I wear the wrong outfit and I always have to have a handheld mic. So anyways, bear with me there. So to Rebecca's point, we all know how many of us are HR folks in this room? Like truly HR. Okay, cool. So we know that our circle of trust is this big, right? We maybe can turn to the person next to us if we're lucky enough to have someone in the office that we can say, oh man, this employee is such a jerk, or this manager did this to me today. But our circle of trust is so small. So if Rebecca and I weren't talking to each other, the people that we actually be open and vulnerable with about our own Me Too stories, then it just kind of told us, what the heck is not being said. So with that, a perfect example is when Rebecca and I, when I was interviewing with Rebecca, I too thought, gosh, me too, I've been so fortunate. But really when we started to dig into it, I was interviewing with Rebecca when I had a 6-week-old son at home, and I had just been eliminated from my previous job while I was on maternity leave, by the way. Yes, that is illegal. So that's something that I didn't bring up with Rebecca in the interview, nor did I tell her far into this Me Too story. So I'll back it up a little bit and tell you about my experience with that employer. So I came from a very large organization, 6-figure salary. I decided to leave. I call it my spiritual awakening. Some might call it a mental breakdown. Whoever you ask, Brene Brown would call it a spiritual awakening. So I left my 6-figure salary and I went to find myself. I'd always had a massive passion for animal welfare, so I decided to go do a passion play, and I ran a adoption program at a nonprofit animal agency for a while. The CEO at the time was middle-aged white dude who was used to getting his way, and here I am, this wide-eyed idealist coming in thinking that I'm going to save all the dogs in the world and I have all the answers. So I got a lot of opinions. I'm also from a family of 5, so who comes from a big family? Yeah, okay. So I'm also the middle child on top of that. So double the loudness and double the opinions, right? So I'm loud and I'm opinionated. And I'm idealist and I'm passionate, right? So all those things are swirling around and I'm starting. And it starts with little comments from him of like, in meetings, oh, Nick, I'm sure you have something to say, right? Small body language, rolling the eyes, crossing the arms, starting to calling me out in large situations of just basically telling me that I'm opinionated. Shortly after that, I got pregnant with my little man. And the comments started to change. And right around 6 months, he started to say, can you sit down? You're making me really uncomfortable. He started to say things like, when are you going out on leave? You shouldn't be here anymore. Why are you still working? Yeah. So it got to the point where it was so stressful that I actually went on parental leave 6 weeks early. And I used up my time early because I just could not be in that environment any longer. Here's what's the sad part. I was still normalizing it all. I still thought that I was going to go back to that situation, which is pretty messed up, right? Right before I'm about to go back, which, mind you, my son was 6 weeks old, I get the call from HR that my job no longer exists. Reason being, they couldn't assume my intent. They couldn't assume that I wanted to come back to work after having a child. Mind you, I gave them no reason of any different. So, fast forward, start talking to Rebecca. I'm having talks with employment lawyers, and they're ready to take the case. And at that time, I have to be super honest, I was emotionally drained. For anyone who's been a new mom, it's exhausting. And you are exhausted and in love at the same time, but it just was too much of an emotional burden for me to take on. So I met Rebecca. We had this serendipitous connection, and we started to uncover our stories together.
So for me, looking back, as I said, I had this thought, well, gosh, I've been really fortunate. And on the whole, I really have. But then I thought, no, wait a minute. You left your last job without another one lined up as the sole breadwinner for your family because the environment had gotten so toxic. And it wasn't even that moment, and I'll tell you that story in a second as well, but it was the realization that it wasn't even in the forefront of my mind that was really a turning point for me. So my story is this. I had spent 13, 14 years in corporate America. I'd worked for a couple of really large retailers, worked my way up the corporate ladder, and then I had the opportunity to go work for an organization that was clear on the other end of the spectrum of structure and process and all of these things. It was an organization, private organization, we'll just give you a little taste of what it was like, where the founder had said his goal was to create a cross between South by Southwest, TED, and Burning Man. And so I came in as a dream for HR, right? So I came in as HR director, although we were operating in an environment that we called holacracy, which are any of you familiar with. It was about a 300-person organization, and we had no people managers. So of course I was not the director of HR because we didn't have titles like that. But going into it, I thought, well, gosh, when else do you get this opportunity to see something like this from the inside out, certainly within HR? We don't ever get this opportunity. And so part of that was really, really attractive. And it was fascinating. It was really, really interesting in the way that really challenging environments can be. And over time, I started to realize, we would have things come up. It would be, so we owned and operated a number of hospitality operations. So we had, for instance, a female security guard who had been hired for the job, and yet she was denied the preferred shift because she was too small in stature, was what had been told to me. So we had that. We had a couple of EEOC claims from women. We had a few of our restaurant general managers had left. They were women, which is actually not super common in this industry. But they had all left, and I listened to not only what they were telling me, but also how they were being described as they left. Well, they just weren't committed enough. Mind you, the expectation was about 70 hours a week for about $30,000 a year. So-and-so just didn't have what it takes, right? So I started to kind of listen to all these things, and after a little while, maybe a little too long to be perfectly honest, I finally started to put these pieces together and realize this is more than just isolated cases. This is more than just things that are happening in a vacuum. And so I sat down with our CEO, our general counsel, and our head of operations, and I said, look, I am not doing my job if I don't lay this out for you. We should be doing things differently because it's the right thing to do. However, if we are not, at the very least, this is a massive, massive liability for this organization, what I am now seeing as a very, very clear and distinct pattern of behavior. This is a terrible place for women to work. And of course, as any good HR person would do, I had all of the evidence and I had all the documentation with me and all of that. And not only did that conversation fall completely on deaf ears, I then became the internal target. All of a sudden now, everywhere I was spending my time, what was I doing, what was my team delivering or not delivering was coming into question where it had never been an issue before. I got the clutching of pearls and gnashing of teeth responses to, how dare you speak to us this way? And the kicker for me was about a week after I told our CEO I was pregnant with our second child, he told me I was going to be added to the layoff list. And yes, it is illegal to do that. So I quit. And what was really interesting is going into that conversation to sit down with the CEO and have that conversation with him. He was, I think, genuinely perplexed. Really was. Why wouldn't you just stick around and wait for the severance that would be part of this layoff? And I said to him, well, quite honestly, there are some things that are more important to me than money. My professional integrity is chief among those things. But also, I cannot be here. I cannot be a party to this. People will assume that however this layoff plays itself out, they're going to assume I had something to do with it. And I can't allow that to happen. And so he offered to write me a LinkedIn recommendation, which I politely declined. Thanks, but no thanks. And I left. So again, that's not a fantastic time to be looking for a new job. And so it was, again, the primary breadwinner for our family. My family and I, we lived off of our savings for a while. Much longer, quite frankly, than we had originally intended. But I am so grateful and recognize that we were in a position to do that. Thank goodness. I did, though. I was so terrified. I sat down before I left, tried one last time. I was trying to get somebody's attention, and I sat down with the general counsel, and I said, it's in this organization's best interest to get me to sign a confidentiality agreement right now. And I was met with a blank stare. And now, I think, as I look back, I thank God for that blank stare, because I still have the ability to tell this story. The hardest part for me were all the women that I thought, oh my goodness, I am in the best position of anyone to be speaking up for the women in this organization, and yet what's going to happen when I leave? And I finally realized you can't affect change here. You're doing everything you can, and yet it's not enough, and it will never be enough. And that's finally when I decided to leave. But now I have this opportunity. As we have progressed, I've realized I finally have this opportunity to speak on behalf of all of those women. So fast forward again, Nickolett and I are looking at all of this happening. We are watching the same thing that all of you are. We had a fairly high-profile salesperson accused of harassment. And it was pretty straightforward. We did the investigation. It was very clear what had happened. And we realized this is an opportunity for us to do it really differently. So this same week, this happened to be the same week as this Time magazine cover, the Person of the Year. They were named the Silence Breakers, right? But all the women who had stepped up, stepped forward. And so instead of sending out the email to say, so-and-so has resigned to pursue other opportunities, has anybody ever sent that one, right? Or the so-and-so has resigned to spend time with his family. Instead of that, we sent out an email saying, so-and-so has been terminated. Come join us on Friday for a meeting we're calling Company Culture in the Era of Me Too. Totally voluntary. We invited all of our employees and our freelancers, but we said, come and join us for this conversation. And that week, every single person in the office showed up.
So like all good things, they start with Oprah, right? So during all of this was happening, it's snowballing, all this momentum is going on, and for the first time on this major stage, we're talking about something other than who are you wearing? What are you wearing tonight? Everyone's wearing black in solidarity. And Oprah's firing everybody up like she does. And I'm going out and creating a t-shirt that says Oprah 2020, me and the rest of the world, right? Rebecca and I are texting and calling each other that night, like just so emotional of like, can you believe this? Like this conversation is happening. Where is this for business? We need to do something. And so with that, the very next day,
I come into the office and someone has put this double-page spread on my desk. And I know I found my people in this office. But if you can't see it in the back, or if you don't remember seeing it when it came out, but it says, he said, she said. He said, she said. He said, she said, she said, she said, and it fills the paper and it says the truth has a voice. And so we're having this conversation. Time's Up has formed. They're having this conversation in the entertainment industry. Where is this in business? Where is this? And we're looking at each other, gosh, what do we do? It feels like we need to do something. And we realize the further we get into it, there's one audience that is really, really critical to this entire conversation who nobody is talking to, and that's HR. And we hear women like Gretchen Carlson, who, when she's being interviewed, she says, yes, well, I tell people that if you're harassed, don't go to HR. And it makes me crazy to hear that. And yet, the sad reality is, in a lot of cases, that's pretty good advice.
Insert HRuprise Instagram. Fun story, it was actually a year ago, almost this week, I was a participant at the Talent 2030 conference. We had launched, these are some of our posts, our earlier post, we had just launched that Monday as like a literal test balloon. Like, is there, putting our feelers out there, is there gonna be any interest for that? We had targeted the HR community. Fast forward a few days, I'm here in the middle of a snowstorm. Was anyone at Talent 2030 last year? Okay, cool. You might have, maybe not, seen some flyers in the bathroom saying HRuprise on them. That was me at that stage. So I was all over it. Like, we're putting feelers out there everywhere. I'm talking to Marla. I'm talking to everyone who was out there saying, like, hey, guess what? We've been complicit. We're raising our hand. We're saying that we want to change the dialogue. Interestingly enough, it just caught on like wildfire. The response was insane. We got Diet Madison Avenue's attention right away. Do you guys remember Diet Madison Avenue, DMA? The agency world remembers DMA. Yep, they were calling everybody out. Their whole platform was that HR is the problem. So the fact that they reached out to us and we said, you're right, how do we fix this together? They were like, holy shit. Is that true? Is that happening? So I will say also that the theme of the conference last year, I was telling Marla this at the break, it was just fascinating because regardless of what the content of that session was, the speakers took a moment to stop, recognize Me Too, and instead of our HR community being on their heels and on the defense and saying, no, we haven't been complicit, it's not us, the dialogue shifted. And we started to question our role in it. And it was the first time that I had heard that conversation happening. And the momentum continued, and I knew that we were on to something.
So in the past almost year, we have learned a ton. And we've got a whole, we could spend hours on all of the things that we have learned, and we do. But we'll give you a little bit of a taste now, and then again, we're gonna lead into the workshops in just a few minutes. But a couple of things have really hit us pretty dramatically. The first that was a huge surprise to us is the number of non-HR people who have reached out. The number of non-HR people who have been following. We heard their stories through direct messages. We heard them through emails. We've heard them through all kinds of different ways. When we do a talk like this, and then a line of people afterwards coming, waiting to tell us their stories too. But the number of non-HR people, even though it's very clear that our target audience really is HR, and yet the number of non-HR people who are following us and are saying, this is resonating really deeply with me. In fact, we even got messages early on of people saying, can you send this to my HR team? How do we get them involved? And for us as HR people, that should really make us sit up and take note. Like, your employees want a different way to do things. They want a more direct and honest conversation with HR. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we have learned is really about HR ourselves. We have stories of our own, and yet we are not telling them. This idea of confidentiality that's inherent in our role, I think it's been Frankensteined over the years, and it has morphed to this idea that it's above all else, that we're not allowed to speak about the things that actually happen. And there's some really good reasons for that, of course, right? There might be a lawsuit risk. There might be We are under an NDA. There are lots and lots of really legitimate reasons for that, and yet we've taken that so far to the extreme. We've gotten really, really good at telling partial truths to ourselves and to our employees. And the last lesson is really a kickoff to Nicolett's workshop as well.
So no one knows what to do about it. That's kind of where we got to, is like, how do we fix this? So insert HRuprise. So we're going to have 2 workshops for you that are really going to speak to thematically what we're being asked the most about, how to solve. So the one that I'll be going over is, instead of traditional harassment training, what can we do instead? Why it doesn't work, why it's broken, how did it originate in the first place? Why is it legally driven, right? And what are some of the ways that we can engage our workforce, kind of building off of everything that we heard earlier of shifting behaviors and changing the story. This workshop will kind of walk you through a very, very, very simple way of how you can literally walk out with something that you can go and take to your agency and implement tomorrow.
And so Nicolette's workshop is going to be across the room, and we will break out in just a few minutes. So across the hallway in the room straight ahead. My workshop will stay in here. We'll probably reshuffle the tables just a little bit. But as I mentioned, we have stories that we need to be telling. We have our own stories of our own experiences. And then we also have what I'm calling the do-overs. As I think back, I've had so many conversations with other HR professionals where we say, yeah, I think about it now. I really wish I could have done that one over. I really wish that I could have done this one differently. And we're going to talk about that too. So we're going to workshop how do we work through these things and have that conversation. So we've got just a couple of minutes at this point. I think what we will do from here, and mostly it's just kind of out of the sake of making sure that the rooms are split somewhat evenly. I think probably the easiest thing to do is to split into kind of 2 halves of the room, although I think we have a few more people in this house, so maybe we will say from here on over. This group will stay in here, and this group will move over. We're going to reach capacity across the hall fairly quickly, so if you do run out of room, you're welcome to come back. We absolutely, though, we're going to have amazing conversation. We do really want to be able to, the one thing we didn't have time for on the agenda was having everybody come back to the room and doing a big kind of report out. So please, please, please use the Slido to share your observations, share the questions that you have. We will definitely be here the rest of today as well, but we're really excited to start diving deep with you all. So we'll go ahead and get started as soon as everybody can get themselves shuffled. Okay, so I think Nicolette had asked before, but I'm really curious. Do we have, who here works in recruiting? Okay. D&I? Yeah? Okay, and then who's a generalist? HR generalist. Okay, good mix. Okay, perfect. That helps. Okay, so we're gonna start breaking this down. As I mentioned before, and honestly, we could go on for hours telling you about what it is we've learned with HRuprise. In so many ways, since the initial kind of reaction, we have just, and what has continued this past year, we've kind of been trying to keep up in so many ways, but we're there. We're having these conversations over and over again that just kind of reinforce the need for all of these things that we're talking about. And it even came up at lunch today with a person at our table who had no idea that we were the ones getting ready to lead these workshops. So it is definitely here. One thing that's become really, really clear for me, and I mentioned this earlier, is that there's still a lot of healing to do. There's a lot of healing for us as individuals. And just so you know, I really have grown to hate the term victim when we're talking about when we're talking about harassment context, and certainly assault context. So I typically will refer to those people as the targets. Still, I haven't found a perfect term, but it's a little bit better than victim. So if you hear me, that's what I'm referring to. But there's a ton of healing that we need to do, so I want to dive a little bit deeper on that. Let's see. All right, clickers are not happy with me today. So going back to, again, I gave you the super, super quick overview in kind of my own Me Too experience. But when I look back at that, it was literally one of the darkest periods of my professional career for sure. And what was so difficult is, so I have a ton of friends who work in HR, and I talked to them through this whole thing. And quite frankly, there was a whole element of, is this really happening? Is this really going down how I think it is? I felt like Alice in Wonderland, and this can't possibly be happening. The one question I get more often than any other is, did you think about suing? Did you think about filing a claim with the EEOC? The answer is absolutely yes, I did. I thought of all of those things, and yet I didn't, because I knew, quite honestly, what would have gotten the attention. None of those things would have gotten the organization's attention, quite frankly. Lawsuit or EEOC, we'd had those before, right? I mentioned them. But what would have probably gotten their attention would have been going public. I can tell you right now, the reporters I would have called, because it was a pretty well-known organization within the city I was living. And yet I didn't, because I didn't want the story to become about me. And again, I think about that now, and about how that in and of itself is such a damaging construct. The fact that I was not the one who perpetrated. I was not the one who was asking my HR partner, well, gosh, I know we can't fire the older employees in this restaurant, but could we create a uniform code that was so unattractive to them that they would just want to quit? Could we just design their uniforms super short so that they'll just want to quit? Literally, these are the things I was dealing with at the time. So, yes, I looked back and I thought, I don't want to, the story is going to become about me. So I want to tell you a little bit about some of the things that I've learned personally as I have started to become more bold and tell this story over and over again. And you notice I'm still somewhat careful not to use the name of the employer, although pretty easy to find it out, and I know that. You can go to my LinkedIn profile if you're really curious. But again, it's even these things, even getting ready to step up on this stage, I think about it over and over. Do I really want to do this? Do I really want to open myself up in this way? And yet, what I have come to understand, I look back, all the ways that we in HR become desensitized too. Again, it's true. The things that I have sat across the table from mostly women, not always, but most of the time it's women, and they've experienced far worse than what I have personally. And yet, there's still so much that we're not talking about. I thought about, back for one of the retailers that I worked with, it was a great company that's very, very pro-employee, very progressive in a lot of ways, and yet I thought about, oh yeah, we had our own whisper network within HR. So we would bring, as many, many big companies do, we'd bring all of our general managers and our HR directors to headquarters for a week of, mandatory fun and, strategy sessions and blah, blah, blah. So we would do that a couple times a year. And we literally would, we had a couple of the general managers that we would say, don't leave me in a room alone with this person. And now I think about it, I'm like, we were HR? That's really messed up. Why was that? And it was not based on just a general feel, it was based on specific comments he had made to other people. And it became that whisper network. And at the time, I just felt really grateful that I had been a part of it, that I had gotten that warning. So that's really, really wrong. And again, this whole experience has really caused me to look back on all of the experiences that we've all had. And it has really caused me to think very, very differently about things that I didn't even realize I had been taking for granted. So here's another one. So leaving that last experience, we moved to Seattle, and I started interviewing after I had our second child. I started interviewing again, and I thought I had some pretty deep reflection thinking about how am I going to handle telling the story about why I left my last job. And so I decided I wasn't going to lie. I was never going to flat out lie, but I was only going to tell enough of the story to satisfy someone in an interview setting. And so it was pretty easy for me to say, well, My daughter was coming along, and I wanted to spend some time, wanted to help my older daughter adjust. We moved, right? So all of those things, and that was enough. And only one person in all of the interviews I did during that round, only one person got far enough. She asked enough questions to get there. Again, it wasn't necessarily actively avoiding it, but I was only telling just enough. But why? Why was I so concerned about that? Because in an interview setting, if somebody speaks ill of their previous employer, we automatically assume that they're the problem, right? I had another friend who's a chief people officer for a Fortune 100 company, and she left her last job because the CEO she was working with was an absolute nightmare. And she said, as I'm doing, she and I had this conversation, she did the exact same thing. And she said, he was the misogynist. Why do I have to be the one to worry about how I present myself in an interview? So it's all of these things that are really, really, we are having to re-examine, but all these ways in which we continue to perpetuate the problem. And we in HR are really at the crux of so much of this. So another huge lesson that I have learned has been the overwhelming response of people coming up and sharing their Me Too stories as well. Yeah, I've been there. I've had, again, long lines of people after talks like this. I had one woman in particular came up, and she waited till the very end, and she was speaking so quietly, I could hardly hear her. And she said, and she was looking around, I just wanted to say thank you for sharing that, but I'm in the middle of that right now, and I don't know what to do. And so I realized, we do not have great support systems for each other either. And we're not supposed to talk about these things in HR, right? We're the keepers of the company's confidential information, and yes, that's absolutely true, and yet how many times are we doing that to our own personal detriment? So here's something else I've learned. We have to share from our scars, not our open wounds. I would not have been in a position to be able to even tell this story 2 years ago, right after it had happened. I was still trying to figure it out. I was still trying to figure out what the heck this all meant. So this has been a huge lesson for me. And it has been a process for me. I started by sharing with my immediate team, and then that actually went just fine. And wow, I had no idea that had happened, right? And so you start to build trust, and then I get up on a stage and I tell the story, right? So it has been a process over time for me. And now what I realize is there are tons of people who are still there with open wounds. And so that's the part that we have to work on healing. But now that I am at the point where it's scars, I feel a responsibility myself. Because I'm in a place where I feel safe to be able to tell the story, now I feel like it's a responsibility. It's a responsibility certainly to all the women at the last company I worked for that I couldn't speak up for then, couldn't find the words for it. And yet it's also a responsibility on the behalf of all of us, right, who have, the odds will tell you that most of us here in this room, if you haven't experienced it directly yourself, you almost certainly know somebody who has. And so we need to find ways to move through and to heal and to get ourselves to the place where we can start to tell these stories. The other thing that occurred to me, so we go back to watching the Christine Blasey Ford testimony, and before her, Anita Hill. And what I have found through this whole thing is that courage is contagious. When someone else, that has been the great lesson of Me Too as well, right? That when someone else has the courage to step forward and say, yep, this happened to me and I'm gonna speak about it, I'm gonna speak my truth, that courage can become contagious too. It has been a huge, huge lesson for me. So there's one other version of stories though, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, but there's one other version of stories too that I have learned through this whole thing that we're not telling. So another friend of mine came into an organization as the chief people officer, and she said through all of this, she's like, gosh, I look back now at this situation, and I saw an investigation file this thick on our chief information officer. And they told me, well, we investigated it, we've dealt with it, it's no longer an issue. And she said, I knew it was not no longer an issue. I knew he just hadn't been caught again yet. And yet, as the brand new chief people officer coming into this organization, she said, I didn't want to rock the boat. I didn't want to come in guns a-blazing. And she said, I really wish I could do that over again. And I look back, and I'll tell you a story that is actually way harder for me to tell now. But I look back, 10, 15 years ago in my career, and I remember sitting in front of an employee, a frontline supervisor, who came to talk to me about his boss. And he thought that his boss was racist. And we sat and we talked through it. And this is the ugly truth. I'm gonna bear it all for you. I honestly didn't think his boss was smart enough to be doing all of the things that he was telling me. I didn't think that he possibly could even be smart enough to have the intent to be racist. And I will tell you, I fully understand now, intent has nothing to do with it. And his impact has everything to do with it. And I know that now, and I still would give anything in the world to go back and sit across from that employee again and do it entirely differently. I didn't do nearly enough for him in that moment. So these are also the stories that we have to, it's taking a lot of courage. It's an ugly truth. And yet, if we don't start to voice these things, if we don't start to talk about them, we are never going to be able to move forward. So what we want to do is shift the, I wish I could do these over, and let's make these do nows. The great Dr. Maya Angelou said, when you know better, you do better. So I can't go back and sit in that chair again across from that employee. But what I can do now is use the platform that I have to talk about it's not enough to just have good intent in the workplace. It's not enough to be non-racist in the workplace. We have to be actively anti-racist. It's not enough to do any of, I know all of these things, and I can now use a platform I have. And I will work through the shame and the guilt and the embarrassment that I feel for not having done enough for that employee at this point in time. But I also recognize I can't go back and change that, but I can do it better. I can do it better now. So it's time for us to put down the armor. It's time for us to put down the guilt and the shame and the embarrassment and all of those things. The vulnerability is really hard to deal with. And yet, at HRuprise, we really do think that this is the only way forward. We have got to be willing to embrace that vulnerability and start to talk about these things. We have to be willing to confront our own complicity and our own bias. Now it's time for us to be bold. So we are now going to lead into the experience. I promised you that. It's a workshop, not just me continuing to talk at you. But here's what I want to do. So I want to start with a couple of ground rules. I think this is really important because this is going to be, I think it's pretty safe to say, pretty different from any other workshop you've been to. So I want to start with a couple of ground rules. First one is we have got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. We've got to be willing to wade through that, to work through it, to sit with the discomfort and not try and fix it. Got to move out of problem-solving mode. So it is our job in HR to try and fix these things. And we're going to get into this, and it's very likely you're going to feel like you want to offer up some kind of suggestion, some guidance, some, hey, have you thought about this? Have you tried this? And that's actually not the purpose of this particular exercise. So try to move out of problem-solving mode. Our goal today is to listen and be present. That's it. Listen and be present. And take in, observe fully kind of what's happening in the room. Now with that, you can opt in or opt out at any point in time. So keep that in mind as well. But I do think if you're willing to jump in to what might feel like a little bit of deep waters, if you're willing to give it a try, I think that you'll find this really, really beneficial. And at the very least, a really good start. So here's what we're going to do. If you have paper in front of you, I think there are probably still some stickies left from the last exercise, or there's some stuff in the middle of the table. We're going to start with just an individual journal exercise. So this is just going to be for yourself. you really want to, you could write an email to yourself, but I would say the temptation's going to be too great to look at the rest of them. So we'll try and go analog for this. So here's the first prompt. I want you to think about a time for yourself when there were things that needed to be said, but either you couldn't or you wouldn't. Think back through your experience, and you probably have more than one. It's good. But think about it again. Jot down a few notes. Again, this is only going to be for you, so it doesn't need a lot of explanation. You'll know what it means. But think about that and reflect on that for a few moments. Can you feel it? What we're going to do now is actually break into groups. I would say break into groups of 2 or 3. It might be better to be with people that you don't know. It's up to you, totally up to you how you want to do this, but I would recommend groups of 2 to 3. Keep in mind, this is not a role-playing exercise, right? We're not here to try and work through and fix these things. Break into groups of 2 to 3, and we're going to do this kind of round robin style. So the first person, you're going to say what it was that you wished you could have said. You're going to say what needs to be said. You don't have to give any context. It doesn't matter, actually, for this. All you're going to do is practice kind of verbalizing that. And for the second or third person who's there with you, what we want for those people to do is, again, be present and observe. And then take note of the emotions and the reactions that are coming up. Take note of what you see for that other person. Take note of what you're feeling yourself. And then we'll share observations. So this will take a few times. Again, we want everybody to get the opportunity to kind of practice it. But again, keep in mind, you don't have to share any context at all. Share as much as you'd like. But we're going to get an opportunity to kind of practice that. So again, break into groups of 2 or 3. I heard a lot of conversation happening. Did everybody get a chance to rotate through? Okay. How about you guys? You get a chance to trade? Okay. Some good conversation happening. Okay, I'm going to pull us back together for a couple of minutes. As I hear some really good dialogue, I'd love for us to have it all together. How did it go? New? It's hard. Yeah, it's really hard. So here's my question for you. So what's so important? And this is, again, I didn't realize I was going to have to use the computer up here. I was trying not to stand on the stage. But so let's talk about this as a large group. Like, what is so important about sharing these stories or saying what needs to be said? What did you talk about in your groups?
I think you pick up a little bit of bravery from other people.
Mm-hmm.
And we all need to be brave.
Can everybody hear that? She said we pick up bravery from each other. Yeah, absolutely. What else? What's so important about this?
I just always, in thinking back to the situations in my career where I could have or should have said something, I always remember that sense of feeling stunned.
Yeah.
Not having access to either words or courage
Yeah.
to say them in that moment. And just like hearing my partner's responses, I think this added to my toolbox. Like I had all these things to say or option, In that moment, I just felt like I had nothing.
Yeah. Well, because we do have those moments that are shocking. Like, did this really just happen? Was that really just said? And we get you get the really good comeback like an hour later, right? We hear this from people a lot, actually. And one of the things that we talk about that I think is so important, and Nicolette's talking about this in the training session right now, too. One of the reasons that we are so focused on bystander intervention or ally training, there are lots of different terms for it, but essentially that style of training is that you get an opportunity to practice. You get oh gosh, it would have been great if I had had that. But the more you talk through it, the more we verbalize these things, the more you get the chance to practice it ahead of time. So that when something happens again, you're more apt and you're trained, right? You have practiced that over and over again, more apt to say something next time. Yeah, thank you. What else? What's so important about sharing these stories?
That you know you're not the only one.
Yeah. It feels really isolating, doesn't it? but we aren't. My work with HRuprise has certainly taught me that. In fact, it happens far more often than we even realize. Yeah, I too appreciate the honesty. I think, again, I'll come back to the goal is not to solve all of these things. And it is really, really uncomfortable because we don't do this. We never do this. And so I'll talk to the event organizers. I'll make sure that none of the personal stories, were, if they were recorded, we'll make sure that we destroy that, because that was definitely not the intent. But much more about just even the opportunity to have this dialogue ourselves. We don't ever do this. We don't have this kind of community. We don't even ever recognize what our role is in all of these things. We just keep forging ahead, and part of our role is to be so focused on everyone else. But I keep coming back to, I think I feel like there's a huge shift happening, certainly in terms of what employees are bringing in to the workplace. There's no longer, at least in my view, and I would love to have this conversation too, but in my view, there is no such thing anymore as leave it at home. I just don't think that's possible anymore, even if we wanted to. And so what we're learning is, I look at, we had a post on HRuprise. It was a video from Rachel Maddow, and she broke down in the middle of she said in her entire career, she's never done this before, but she broke down in the middle of it. And it was when children and parents were being separated at the border. And that same week, I had probably 4 or 5 different employees, high-level leaders within our organization, coming into me saying, what does this even matter anymore? Why are we here? I can't shut this off. I don't know what to do. I feel so helpless. I feel so hopeless. What do we even do? And it was a huge, huge lesson for me at that moment that we can no longer, there might have been an ethos at one point in time, right? That, we have work and then we have home and we separate the two and ne'er the two shall meet. But I just don't think that's possible anymore. And certainly that's not the expectation when you think about the younger generations coming in. They don't operate that way. And even for those of us who might be older, we just don't. And so then how do we really, truly, again, what I keep coming back to is how do we tell the whole truth? That's hard. It's a hard conversation to have. It's really uncomfortable, and we're going to screw it up. And we're going to mess things up, and we might offend somebody, whether we meant to or not, and then we're going to have to wrestle with that. And yet, over and over again, what I keep coming back to is that the strength, and the only way forward is really through that vulnerability to acknowledge where we are, to fully acknowledge our role as well. JR and I were just chatting about it. He said, really what we're talking about here is we're calling ourselves to a higher level of accountability within the HR profession. That's absolutely, I'm unapologetic about that. That's exactly what we're doing. Calling ourselves to a higher level of accountability, because you look at our employees, look at the Google walkout. Employees are holding their leadership now to a higher level of accountability. Right? It was a great, amazing moment in time, global movement. But employees are saying, this is not acceptable anymore, and we're going to use what we have to show that. So whether we want to or not, whether our leadership is bought in or not, things are changing really dramatically. And I think if we aren't there and a part of leading the way, part of it, I think, is really through these vulnerable conversations and acknowledgement of maybe some ugly truths. Again, if we can acknowledge it and figure out how to do better going forward, I really think that's the way forward. So what does this mean for us? We started to get in this a little bit already, but what does this mean for us in our roles? What does this mean for us in HR? How do you feel about this idea of holding ourselves to a higher level of accountability?